Hi, everyone. I'm Zeke Kimball. I'm the coordinator of research for the ACPA Coalition for Disability. And we're really pleased today to have Ryan Miller here with us for a Research Roundtable. Ryan's an assistant professor of educational leadership at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. An awful lot of his work focuses on the experiences of students with disabilities in the post-secondary learning environment. And more generally, he's an expert on student development and the creation of inclusive campus climates in higher education. Ryan's work on students with disabilities received the 2016 Melvene Hardee Dissertation of the Year Award from NASPA. And prior to becoming a faculty member, Ryan worked in several different capacities related to student affairs. We're really pleased to have him with us today. And to share some of his work. In general, what we're going to do today is Ryan's going to talk for roughly half the time. And if you have any really pressing questions, I would invite you to share those with me via the text feature that'll come directly to the conference coordinators. At the end of Ryan's formal presentation, there will be an opportunity for everybody to ask questions. And the way that that'll work is if there's a question that you would like to ask, go ahead and raise your hand using the feature next to your name on the GoToWebinar control panel. And once we are in the question mode, I will turn on your microphone and we can go from there. So with that, I'll say, Ryan, thank you once again for being here, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share.
All right, Zeke, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining me for a little bit of time this afternoon, or morning, I guess, depending on where you are. So I have some slides that I'm going to run through, and then we'll also get to the Q&A and conversation. And bear with me for a second, because I am going to attempt to share my screen so that you can see those slides. All right.
And you did do that successfully.
Okay, so you can see the slides now, Zeke. Okay. All right, great. So yeah, again, Zeke, thank you so much for the introduction. So I want to share a little bit about myself and my research, and then I'm really excited to get to conversation and questions. I do use he, him, his pronouns. I teach in the higher ed program at UNC Charlotte. I also teach some courses in research methods for our graduate students in the College of Education. I've got a link in the slides, and I think you're going to have access to this as a handout as well, that just links to my directory page through UNCC. And there are, if you go to that page, I have some links to other sites where I have posted many of my papers that I'm able to. And if you can't find any there that I talk about or that you're interested in, please definitely feel free to email me. I've got my Twitter handle there as well. I admit to being a novice Twitter user, but I'm learning all the time. So we'll get started. So first, I just want to give a very brief roadmap. I'll share a little bit about my background, and then for the research that I'm going to be talking about, it's important to touch on just briefly some notions of disability studies, as well as intersectionality that have informed my work. I'll share a bit from my study and some publications that are available on it, and preview some that are coming up. And then probably the most interesting part will, of course, be questions and conversation. So that is our plan for today. So in any research endeavor, in any professional endeavor, I really value reflecting on my own relationship to the work that I'm doing, my own positionality. So I think it's important to start briefly with sort of who I am and how I enter this particular conversation. So my background is really a student affairs professional. So that's largely been my experience in higher ed. I've also dabbled in some other areas before joining the faculty, some time with institutional research and admissions and some other pieces as well. But one of the most pivotal professional experiences that I've had, and that really has shaped a lot of my research agenda, in particular the project I'm going to be talking about today, was my time at the University of North Florida. And I started there, at this point, it was about 8 or 9 years ago, I suppose. And I was charged with running the LGBT Resource Center out of our Student Affairs Division. And that was it was a really rewarding time professionally. I was given a lot of freedom, a lot of challenge and support, as anyone would want in a role like that. And it's something that I was really struck as I entered that position and I got to know students I was working with on that campus, how ready the students were to have really sophisticated and in-depth conversations about their identities and their multiple identities, their intersecting identities. And so, you know, even though our title was the LGBT Resource Center, students came in wanting to talk about race, class, religion, ability and disability, mental health, so many topics. And it was through those conversations, you know, I did a lot of listening and I realized that I had a lot more to learn. And I still very much do. And in particular, there was a very, very active contingent of some students and student leaders with disabilities and working through mental health issues as well. And that's where some of the genesis for the research that I'm going to talk about today actually started. I had the opportunity to connect with a lot of my colleagues in other identity-based spaces at the University of North Florida. So working with my counterparts in the Disability Resource Center, the Intercultural Center, the Women's Center, the Interfaith Center, to come together and to think about how we could be advocates for students, how we could get out of the way and let students empower and advocate for themselves as well. And part of that leads into my next point is really sort of my teaching philosophy, which I don't view myself as a lecturer. I view myself as more of a facilitator. And so I come out of an intergroup dialogue perspective and have spent some significant time throughout my career as a student of intergroup dialogue, as a facilitator and instructor as well. And so that really shapes a lot of what I do and probably signals why I'm excited to get to the conversation part. So now as a faculty member, my research agenda, you know, I really view all the work that I do is very much rooted in practice, you know, in my own experience as a student affairs professional and view myself as a scholar practitioner. And so I'm going to talk most today about this strand and one particular project that relates to students, but I'm also interested very much in the experiences of faculty. So I've got a new project going, new as of about a year and a half ago, that focuses on faculty who are teaching diversity courses that are required of undergraduates, and what are their experiences and what's the challenges, the successes that they face. So that's another strand. And then institutional structures and administration. And so a piece of that I have been working on and publishing from a bit is work around bias response teams in higher education and looking at their philosophy, their operations, their effectiveness, you know, all of that. So that's a bit about what I research, but it all comes back to this idea of inclusive campus cultures and climates in higher ed. So my doctorate was from UT Austin, the University of Texas, and in higher ed. And this project that I'm going to talk about today around intersections of LGBT identities and disability identities was my dissertation project. And I've had some spin-offs since then, but it all sort of started there. Of course, in terms of my positionality, I'm someone who, in terms of if we look down the list of privileged identities, I'm someone who holds a lot of those. As a white man, as a cisgender person, as a Christian, as temporarily able-bodied. And it's also important that I do identify as queer and that a lot of my work is grounded in being a first-generation collegian and college graduate, that I feel like that always informs my perspective and that I don't take anything in the higher ed enterprise for granted, hopefully. And I say that not to just list those identities, but in relation to this particular project, and learning about the experiences of students with disabilities and how we might improve campus environments around disability. I entered this project having a little bit of trepidation around, you know, I have this privileged identity around this axis of identity, and how would folks respond to me? And so it's something that I feel like is important for me to continue to be mindful of, how can I make this research as collaborative, as open, as accessible as possible. But also thinking as well about, I was really surprised to see that sometimes, you know, being a quote unquote outsider around this identity could actually be a strength. And in the context of this study, I think that it was helpful to build rapport with students around a shared queer or LGBTQ, sort of membership in the community. But I found around issues of disability and impairment that students were actually really, once we started to build rapport, were really willing to share their experiences. And since they knew I did not identify or have a disability, that they couldn't just say, well, you know how it is. You've experienced this, And in a really interesting way, I think that prompted them to tell rich stories, to tell complex stories, and to be really open and honest. So I don't take that for granted or take it lightly. So I like to sometimes complicate this notion of sort of strict insider or outsider, and think about how that binary might not always serve us. So, so I mentioned for some framing of this, I did want to talk about disability studies and intersectionality. So a few words around disability studies. So while I was at UT Austin, I had the great opportunity to earn a portfolio in disability studies from the Texas Center for Disability Studies. And so I've looked at the definition that they have there. And so there's really a focus and emphasis on the way in which disability is constructed, culturally, politically, and economically, rather than the traditional emphasis on the physiology of impairment. And so that's something that I try to incorporate into my work, and that I'm thinking largely from that perspective. We also know from disability studies that really, as Simi Linton has said, the subjectivity and agency of disabled people is a vital component of that, both as researchers, as researcher participants, all sides of the coin, and that there has been, a really, I don't know how else to say it other than a disturbing, exploitative, oppressive history of research that has been, I would use the verb sort of on people with disabilities, and not by people with disabilities always, and not always for people with disabilities, but to serve the interests of others. And in the course of this project, I actually had the opportunity to talk with students before we ever did the interview about some of that history, and about, by contrast, what were some of my goals for doing this work, and how can I be someone who tells complex stories, and tries to lift that up. I also go back to the definition from the Coalition for Disability that talks about viewing disability as a tenet of diversity, and that's something that I'm invested in as well. That any of our conversations around equity and inclusion, that disability, should be part of the conversation, should be centered, absolutely. So I've got on this slide some of the thinking, just to expand on what I was talking about previously, about different ways that disability can be approached. And so there's an article from 1998, Disability Studies / Not Disability Studies, from Simi Linton, that I cite here and have in the references later. And so in that article, you see kind of this distinction between what might not be disability studies and what might be disability studies. And so when I think about and pulling from that article some of what might not be, models around sort of pity, or the moral model that presents disability as sort of a moral failing, or this really heavy emphasis on medicine and pathology that presents disability merely as sort of a problem to be fixed. And all of these notions on that left side really focus on sort of making disability very individual, as something that impairment or disability really just resides within the individual, rather than being an issue that all of us need to grapple with and think about how we design environments and spaces. So I tend to do in my work much less of that. I try to avoid that. And so looking at the right side of the screen, toward and beyond social models of disability. So again, really thinking about, what about the environment? What about the built environment, the designed environment, even the natural environment? How does that work in relation to disability? I very much try to take up disability as a marker of identity. I subscribe, again, to some of the cultural and political notions of impairment and disability, and there's various models around this. But I think it's important too to look at both the person and the environment, the disability or impairment and the environment, and what is the interaction going on there. And I think you'll see that come out through my work as well. This is also, if we get more to this side of the spectrum, where we see sort of a social justice model, acknowledging ableism and oppression, looking at intersectionality in more radical and critical models. I do want to give an acknowledgement to some of my colleagues. So up at the top, this 2017 reference from Nancy Evans and colleagues. So the book, Disability in Higher Education, A Social Justice Approach, which you may already be familiar with, hopefully. But new book, and if you're interested in this conversation, they unpack a whole lot in that book. But in particular, I found their treatment of sort of some of this history and some of the models and approaches around disability really helpful, and I'm already using it in some of my teaching and research. You'll also see, I didn't point this out earlier at the bottom of this slide, sort of a spectrum that if we think about even epistemological approaches to disability, that we've seen approaches at all ends if we think of this as a spectrum. So again, some of those I was talking about on the left with the medical model might be more post-positivist, but some of those on the right that I talked about and that I try to position myself in my research is more constructivist, critical, even at times postmodern. So with that said, I do want to frame my study a little bit. So I was really interested in this question of, so this intersection of LGBTQ identities and disability, and how students view that, both graduate and undergraduate students, how they viewed those particular intersections of identity. And also knowing that these experiences don't take place in a vacuum, that context is always certainly key. And so, so this study taking place at a predominantly white research university in the South, there's obviously pieces of context of that come out in students' journeys. So one word briefly before we proceed, even though we could spend a whole afternoon on intersectionality and thinking about that. You know, so I do use that term that's in the research question, and of course go back to Kimberly Crenshaw and her work around critical legal scholarship. And also Black feminist thought and the work largely of women of color who have named this concept and who have provided it. And so Crenshaw looked at race and gender, so the tendency to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience and analysis, which resulted in Black women being theoretically erased. But by the way, this is an aside, if you haven't seen her recent, I don't know if it was in the last year or two, but her recent TED Talk where she talks about this, it's really helpful. I was showing that to a class recently. So in the same way, so I want to think about an intersectional framework that centers the voices of people of color and groups that are multiply marginalized and oppressed, so at the intersections of these various identities that are oppressed. And in the same way, I want to think about how has some of our scholarship and our thinking about LGBTQ identities left out disability and mental health, and vice versa. How has some of our thinking about impairment, disability, mental health not fully acknowledged the spectrum of gender and sexuality, and try to put those in conversation with each other. I'm also reminded, and this is something that that I don't think I've gotten this right yet, but really thinking about you know, intersectionality being connected to these larger systems of power, striving for social justice as a goal, being critical in that sense. And so, so there has been critique of some ways that folks have taken up intersectionality, that if it relies too heavily on sort of the individual experience or the individual narrative of identity, how do we lose focus on those larger systems? So that's something that, again, I don't have that figured out, but I try to think about and be cognizant of and explore further. So I should note as well in this study that you'll see from my research questions that I use umbrella terms, including disability and LGBTQ, or interchangeably with queer. And that's something that there are certainly benefits and drawbacks to framing a study with those very expansive disability umbrella terms that don't all mean the same thing to everyone. And so I think about some of the work of Margaret Price, who wrote the book Mad at School. And Price, she talks about this idea of mental disability and sort of looking at that as an umbrella term and wondering sort of what advantages, what possibilities could we open up with collective advocacy. And so she issues this call for both local specificity and broad coalitions for maximum advantage. And so in the context of my work, I think that, you know, I'm trying to approach this in a broad sort of coalitional way with these umbrella terms, but that does not negate the need for sort of local specificity and local geographic context. Or if you think about my study, you know, what about the experiences more specifically of, for instance, gay men with on the autism spectrum, right? So there's all different kinds of ways that we could approach this. There has been very little work at this particular intersection framed in this way in higher ed. We've got some of the work was non-empirical and not sort of based on research studies, but there was one article from Henry and colleagues in 2010 that looked at the experience of one student, I believe a gay male student with physical disabilities, and his experiences on campus. So from there, I knew we could do a little more work around this, and there's definitely a contribution, I think, to make here. Whenever we talk about this particular intersection of identities, people have tended to draw, scholars have tended to draw some comparisons, some analogies between identities. Others have then sort of critiqued that and tried to unpack that. But there are, so Mark Sherry has this article, Overlaps and Contradictions in Queer Theory and Disability Studies, where he examines some of these potential similarities and sort of points of convergence, and as well as some of the very key distinctions. And so, you know, if we think about sort of identity issues, either of these particular identities could be, for some people, could be considered less visible, could at times be hidden, could sometimes be perceived as invisible, and some folks might have the ability to pass. So there could be some similar ways of thinking about and constructing identity. That might also entail, for those folks, a coming out process or a disclosure process around these identities. You know, we think about even that first bullet point, isolation from family, in that often, but not always, folks with disabilities and LGBTQ folks might not necessarily grow up in a family or in a community where that particular aspect of identity is shared. Of course, there are also very key differences. And when we think about some of the popular tropes and stereotypes around LGBTQ people have often been hypersexualized and sort of reduced to our sexuality. But then if we think, you know, about some stereotypes and misinformation around folks with disabilities have often been asexualized or viewed as not having sexuality. So, you know, so what does that mean for a person who is at the intersection of those identities, right? So I'll move on from this for the sake of time, but as you can see from some of these citations, there's lots of work sort of unpacking this issue. So I'm not gonna dwell too much on methods. I do frame most of the study around this idea of constructivist grounded theory. But as I have continued to do some spin-offs from this project and write different pieces and present different pieces, I've been interested in using some different theoretical frames depending on the topic, depending on the subject matter. And so sometimes that has involved situational analysis, which is a postmodern take on grounded theory from Adele Clark. But the primary data I'm drawing from are in-depth semi-structured interviews with 25 students who identified, you know, as LGBTQ and as having one or more disabilities. I've also done some work with some colleagues at another institution, Chris Webb and Richmond Wynn from the University of North Florida, where they did a similar version of this study at a regional university in the South, but same criteria, similar questions, that sort of thing. It was really important for me in this project, and actually all projects that I do, to think about how could, if as a qualitative researcher and as an interview-based project, how could I try and make this work accessible and convenient and collaborative to the extent that I could with participants, and hopefully that they get some, you know, real benefit out of this project, that it's not just benefiting me as a researcher and as someone who's writing up results and presenting them. And so I thought through things that I know these aren't earth-shattering, but I thought through things like really giving participants as much control as possible over where the interview takes place, when it takes place. So I would come up to campus on the weekend because that was the best time for some participants. Giving them control over the interview protocol to the extent that I would say, here are the questions I want to ask, but I view this as an opportunity for you to tell your story in the way that you want to tell it. And so if that means skipping questions, if that means we do this out of order, if that means sort of I ask you one question and then you talk for the next 30 minutes, that's okay. And that, sort of meets my goals as well. Also, this emphasis on member checking, but not just sharing transcripts with participants that, sort of a baseline that we often think about, but also emergent findings, getting their reactions, seeing what folks who participated really thought. And I'm happy to say that I had some great response from participants and some follow-up conversations about the findings. And several participants who talked about that this really made them feel validated, made them feel less alone, less isolated. And with some participants, actually, we kind of went from the researcher-participant relationship to more of almost mentor-mentee, or more of a friendship developing. And there were some participants that would continue to reach out to me. We would continue to meet, not for the sake of interviews or the research, but just keeping in touch and sort of thinking about their what they have going on in their lives. So just briefly, some notes on how participants self-identified. So this particular group largely you see, so 76% identifying with psychological disabilities, or what some people term mental health challenges, mental health issues, mental health disabilities. So that sort of predominated, but we did also see a mix of medical disabilities, ADHD, autism spectrum, and some others as well. But I think that does inform some of the findings. I have some stats up here on gender and racial and ethnic and sexual orientation diversity as well. The racial diversity, while predominantly white, it largely reflected sort of the makeup of that campus, although white students sort of overrepresented, and African American and Asian American students in particular being underrepresented. So what I want to share just briefly, thinking of time, is sort of some of what I think of as really the central findings or the heart of this project that I did. And so I presented and proposed what I call 5 intersectional identity perspectives on queer and disability identities. And this is actually, this particular work is going to be coming out in an article in the Journal of College Student Development. I actually got the copy edits on it this morning. So I think that means it's going to be published sometime this year, maybe in the next few months or so. So that is coming out. And I also have the accepted version. I have it posted on the web as well if you're interested in diving into a little more. So I want to spend just a few minutes unpacking, going through some of these 5 perspectives. So the first perspective that some students embraced, was this truly intersectional perspective. So using that language even of intersectionality and social justice. And I found that for many students, it was through women's studies classes and African American studies classes and Mexican American studies classes that students often sort of found or subscribed to that language and learned it. Also through their activist and leadership experiences on campus as well. And so even for the students who embraced this really intersectional perspective, there was a tension between intersectionality in theory and intersectionality in practice. And so one particular student, Abby, she had said, I see the links between the disruptive potential of queerness and the disruptive potential of disability, and how they're really both about calling out the structures for their assumptions about heteronormativity and able-bodiedness and all of these things. But in terms of me personally in my life, it's not that simple. And part of what Abby was alluding to was that she had narcolepsy. And she talked about that sort of some of the activities that she felt, either social activities or activist activities, she felt called to engage in as a queer person. She felt like there was sometimes this tension with narcolepsy and needing to keep sort of a more strict sleeping schedule. And so she was someone who saw it in theory and maybe a little less in practice for her. So that varied by participants as well. So the second perspective that I want to introduce is identities as interactive. So this is different from the last one because multiple identities would actually be perceived as distinct by participants, but they had some relationship. They had either a mutually dependent, a mutually reinforcing relationship, and that could actually be positive or negative. And so one participant who exemplified this really well was Christopher. And he was a student, gay male student in the fine arts with ADHD. And so he said, when I actually started medication for the first time, I said, I don't want my creative side to go away, because what makes my creative side work is that I'm constantly thinking about, they'll say, have you thought about this? And I'm like, yeah, I thought about that 12 steps ago, because of that nonstop racing mind that we have as people with ADHD. That's kind of fueled what I do. So for Christopher, sort of this piece of creativity in the fine arts and his identity as a gay man and with ADHD all sort of reinforced each other in what he framed in a really positive way. There was another example of a participant who he talked about having bipolar disorder and identifying as a gay man, and those being mutually reinforcing in a negative way. He said that he had previously been closeted about both identities, and he felt like that had sort of this vicious cycle, this effect of sort of a spiral of negativity for him. So folks framed it in different ways. The third one would be identities as overlapping. And so students talked about sort of this overlap in either the experience of queerness and disability broadly defined, again, thinking back to some of those overlaps and contradictions I mentioned, or they saw in the population, sort of with people they knew and groups they knew, that there were a lot of overlaps. And so that disability communities had a lot of queer people and vice versa. And I really started to think about and go back and ask sort of why was this a particular perspective? And I proposed that students viewed this, embrace this perspective as a way to sort of identify people like them, as a way to build community with others and seek solidarity, often connected to sort of activist aims, and also a way to combat isolation. In particular, the mental health piece comes out a lot here because folks have talked about anxiety and depression being very common in queer communities and often being a common topic of conversation. So one participant, Miranda, said, I almost feel like there's a higher than normal proportion of queer people in the disabled community. I think maybe it's because there's a higher level of comfort there because there's an openness to it. And other participants echoed almost very, very similarly those same words. So the fourth perspective is identities as parallel. And so in this perspective, students created and constructed these comparisons or analogies between their multiple identities. And I viewed this, when I think of sort of why this perspective, what did it mean for students? I think it was one way to build resilience. So if I'm confronted with oppression and marginalization, if I'm having a difficult time on campus, around one of these identities, what if I could draw on my past experiences? If I don't have other resources, I have this resource that, hey, maybe, maybe I didn't have a disability diagnosis before college, but I came out as queer in high school. So maybe that could be a resource that I could draw on to think about how I might frame this identity, or vice versa. So one participant, Danny, said, I think the biggest way I see them both influencing my life in the same way is that in both my disability and sexuality, I have to come out over and over and over again, or people won't know. That's a plus in the sense that I can also choose not to. I would say I take that route with my disability more often than not. I think that for both, I feel like there's just this assumption that I'm straight and that I'm normally able. So here we see those larger assumptions from heterosexism and ableism sort of affecting participants. And for Danny, I think it was resilience building, because it was saying, she was acknowledging, I have to disclose these identities or people might not know that about me. So I can sort of compare these processes and think about, what did I learn from one that I can apply to the other? And last but not least, identities as oppositional. So participants admitted that there were some times, or many times, that their identities felt like they were in conflict or were disconnected. And this is something that I think really highlights the strain of, again, living at those intersections of multiple systems of oppression. And that students, to a person, did acknowledge that they have these multiple identities. But there were times when it did not make sense for them to embrace this explicitly intersectional view of identity. So in that way, I think that this could really be a self-protective strategy, that to sort of think about how to navigate these multiple systems of oppression and what one is going to deal with at any given time, right? But it was also a temporary strategy. So Will, who identified as a gay man on the autism spectrum, he said it's this constant clash of the two different identities. It's easier to just like stay inside and shut the world out than it is to like try to interact with other gay people sometimes. But it's hard to pretend you're an extroverted in a world designed for extroverts, but you're an introvert. So he saw the two identities as pulling in different directions, one pulling in an introverted direction, one in an extroverted direction. So just briefly to make some sense out of all of this, I think it's important to note that, of those 5 perspectives I just talked about, no student embraced only one. I saw evidence from my interviews with students that every single student embraced more than one. And so what I saw in that is really a lot of creativity, a lot of resilience building, that students were figuring out, how do I make sense of my experiences, even if I may not know a lot of other people like me who are experiencing these particular intersections? How do I navigate different contexts, and how do I learn to resist oppression and fight back against it? There were some students, in fact, who embraced, I saw at different times in our interview and our conversation, evidence of all 5 perspectives. But for everyone, it was at least 2 of those. I think that last perspective, the opposition or disconnection, has brought up some of the most tension that as I think about this study, because when we think about intersectionality, we often think about that's rejecting this sort of additive approach, or to say that, one identity is disconnected. When I think of intersectionality, I think of sort of bringing your whole self to the room. And this is where, in conversation with others, and I'm still grappling with this, of how to think about intersectionality as this critique of power relations, and how is it the effect of oppression and marginalization that really causes participants to embrace these different perspectives, even simultaneously, that we might think at first glance, is that contradictory? How do you embrace all of that at once? But I think that students were able to do that really creatively. So I think, so I'm just about at the end. I know I've talked for more than I said I would, but I did want to share some references to my current work and some spinoffs that were rooted in the study and have come from it. And again, please feel free to contact me if you're interested in any of these, and I can share them. And there is, what I've mainly talked about today is that second reference that's in press right now at the Journal of College Student Development, and is available online, the accepted version, but will hopefully be in its final form somewhat soon. And then at the very end, I've got references for some of the other references that I talked about during my talk. So with that, I have rambled on, and I'm anxious to get to some conversation with you all.
All right, Ryan, thank you so much. And so we have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions, if anybody has one. The way to show that you have a question would be to kind of raise your hand on the little participant flag, or if you're having a hard time doing that, there is a question function as well. And if you start typing there, we'll unmute your mic and you can ask your question aloud if you would like to do so, or you can certainly complete your question via text. So Ryan, while we're waiting for some other questions,
Sure.
I do have a question for you, and it's a little bit of minutia, so I wasn't going to lead with it, and maybe was going to even ask it offline.
All right.
So I know you to be someone who epistemologically exists at the kind of more critical postmodern end of the kind of epistemological perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I noted as you were talking through your findings that one of the things that you did is you talked about how frequently a theme appeared within your data set. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you made that particular methodological choice and how it kind of squares with your epistemological orientation.
Yeah, we'll just lead with the easy question, right, Zeke?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, I appreciate the question, and it's and I have thought a little bit about that, and I do, and you to what I think you're referencing. So I've got, for instance, on this first perspective, identities as intersectional, evidence by 10 of 25 participants, and that's sort of an interesting choice, right, for someone. And I think you captured sort of where I tend to gravitate in terms of epistemology and sort of how I frame things. So one might ask, for someone who's not exclusively but very firmly a qualitative researcher, often more on the critical end of things, sort of why the counting, and why sort of the quantification of experience in that way. And I think, I think part of it for me is that I wanted to give some sense when I shared this work, of sort of, 25 participants for a study like this is, what could be considered kind of a high number. And so I wanted to share some sort of sense, sort of at a glance, of kind of prevalence of the degree to which participants embraced or did not embrace a particular perspective of the five. And I think that part of why I do that is because I think that some of that prevalence might be surprising. Some of it, when I was doing this work and analysis, actually kind of caught me by surprise. So I naively expected that this first perspective, identities as intersectional, would be, I thought, oh, well, people are responding to this study that even uses the language of intersectionality. I imagine that students are really just going to embrace this. And you see, I really only saw that articulated explicitly by 10 of the 25 participants. Whereas something like the other ones were embraced by quite a few, and you can see the overlap. But something like that last perspective, oppositional, evidence by 17 of 25 participants. So I think it was something that it was surprising, and I think worth noting, and I hope can give people a sense of sort of, again, just kind of prevalence of where that's at. I think, though, it's important, I don't want to get stuck on, given my outlook, I don't want to get stuck just on those numbers, but I think it might be surprising to other people, and I think it also illustrates, when you look at these numbers and add them up, so 17 of 25, 21, 18, that just how much participants were embracing multiple perspectives. And it's not that, this was not designed to sort of sort participants out into 1 or 5 perspectives, but to show how folks really embrace multiple perspectives. So,
all right.
but
Well,
I'm still grappling with that issue. So,
well, thank you for answering that, and I think it's a really it's a well-reasoned methodological perspective, but that was the one that I could think of to buy some other folks some time to ask questions. And now, given that level of methodological minutia, we have lots of questions from people who don't want me to ask another question. And I don't know if you can see these as well, Ryan, but I'm going to go ahead and read them just so that everybody will know what you've been asked. So this question is from Jennifer. And Jennifer would like you to speak about best practices for supporting students at this intersection in the higher education setting, and would also like to know if students talked about what has made them feel welcomed at home or what hasn't.
Yeah, those are great questions. So in terms of, I'm going to flip the slide over just a bit here. So the question of sort of best practices or, sort of implications, especially in practice, that come to mind, some of it really was about the environment. So about the university, even sort of the architecture and how we divide things up within the university. So I don't talk a lot about it in this particular presentation, but I also had conversations with students around campus resources and how they engaged or not with those resources and what were their experiences. So thinking about, in particular, some of the common ones that came up in conversation were disability services offices, counseling and mental health centers, and LGBTQ or gender and sexuality centers. And, sort of one sort of upfront takeaway from that was that students didn't always feel like, again, that they could bring their whole selves and all of their identities to those particular spaces, and felt like, was gender and sexuality something that would even be relevant, or would it be something I could talk about at, for instance, the disability services office? And participants, I found, really were in tune with reading the environment and reading some of the what we might think of as sort of small visual cues to see if a place or a person might hopefully be open to that conversation or at least aware of it. So it meant something when participants saw at a disability services office that staff had sort of the LGBTQ safe space ally, placard or sign or safe zone sign. That's something that, we might not in our day-to-day always think about the importance of that, but it's something that participants really noticed. So this was a campus that had a disability advocacy training program and also sort of the sign or placard. And so they would notice that, students would notice that in spaces and feel a little more brave to bring things up. So I think, even if we can't do away today with some of these structures that sort of are from the singular identity approach, how can offices collaborate more? How can offices and campus resources, and by the way, that's not just for sort of the disability or gender and sexuality based resources, but I think it's for all of us. How do we convey that? How do we expect in any given space that we are going to have folks living at these particular intersections? We are going to have queer students with disabilities. So it's not enough just to ask about pronouns. Are we also asking in our conversations or for our programming or events what sorts of accommodations or design features that folks might need? So those are a few things that come to mind. I think that a lot of students were at times really hesitant to open up a conversation with a faculty or a staff member if they didn't have some indication of where you stood kind of on these issues, and that you would be hopefully an open, welcoming, person, or that you would be aware of resources. So I think, for the sake of time, I'll just leave it there. But I think it's important, even though, yes, we all know about training, we know about these cues we should make, but I think that they really do still make a difference to students on the day-to-day. I've forgotten the second part of that question, Zeke, and I don't know that I can see the questions. Could you remind me?
So the second question was around what has made students feel particularly welcomed at home or hasn't made them feel that way.
Oh, yeah. That's something, I'll be honest. So even though that was a part of a lot of these interviews, and I have some of the questions that I asked sort of at the beginning of the interview, for most were around sort of formative experiences, growing up, formative experiences in schools, things like that. But I didn't find it it didn't end up being sort of a kind of a central piece. But it's hard for me to think about how to boil that down, because it depended so much, I think, on at what stage of life that a student came to know, accept, disclose, share, for instance, their LGBTQ identity, and also at what age, so did they have an impairment or disability from birth, or was it acquired later? When was it diagnosed? So, participants did talk about that process of diagnosis. So it varied so much, because for some folks, it was around disability and how that developed for them, and that transition to higher education and becoming more of a self-advocate. Whereas other participants, they had embraced a queer identity or a trans identity in their youth and had been involved with, say, their GSA, or had started it in some cases, and didn't really address something like mental health issues until they came to higher ed. So it's hard for me to summarize that, other than to say that students did have some difficult experiences, particularly around gender and sexuality, and disclosing and sharing that in the context of parents and family and at home, and really viewed higher ed as an opportunity to embrace that more and to have some more, be in a more open and accepting environment around that. So participants, some I remember talked about that at home, they might, with family, they might have support and have had support earlier in life around disability or impairment and how to navigate that, and feeling supported by parents who might then turn around and not support or embrace, their identity in terms of gender or sexuality. So I hope that offers just a little bit of that, but it's something that I would like to explore more.
Great, thank you. And so the next question comes from Kirsten. Could you share a little bit more about your upcoming work on the intersection of autism and gay men? And are there autistic women or non-binary folks in your data set?
Yes. Hi, Kirsten. So, and thank you for that question. So yes, I am one sort of spinoff or piece from this study is intentionally thinking about the experiences of queer folks on the autism spectrum. And it's actually, so it's not just gay men. So for this particular work, and I'm collaborating with Brett, Rain, and Nachman at the University of Wisconsin. And for this particular project, we're looking at participants both from, I had mentioned, from my study that I conducted, as well as another one that was conducted at another university in the South. And so we have a total of, I think it's eight participants whose narratives we're going to be looking at and doing some secondary analysis of. And I'm happy to say that we do have some good gender diversity there, in terms of it's not just folks who identify as men, also folks who identify as women, who identify as trans, and who identify as genderqueer. The exact numbers of that escape me at the moment, but there is gender diversity in that. And so that's something that we're working on right now and starting to scratch the surface on. We're going to be planning to, I believe we're going to be putting in a proposal for ASH and maybe some other conferences around it, and then of course hoping to share it more broadly as we move forward as well. So thanks for that question.
Great, thank you. And so the next question comes from JD, and the question is, at our LGBTQA plus center, we're looking at purchasing Sins Invalid, the movie that we've been told looks at this intersection. Have you seen this movie, and could you give your opinion of it?
No, I haven't. So I'm going to write that down. So I'm not familiar with it. So thank you for sharing that.
All right. And so the next question comes from Rachel. Could you share a bit about your research around the impact of online communities for queer and disability identity making?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you for that question. So in particular, so I had a piece in the Journal of College Student Development last year in 2017. This was something, from this larger project that actually, this was another piece that sort of took me by surprise, because I didn't go into this project actually having, a section of the interview protocol where I really wanted to dive into students' online experiences and experiences with social media. But it was one of those things, one of those experiences where every conversation, as we talked about identity, as we talked about disclosure, as we talked about building community, quite literally, I think in every conversation there was some piece around, here's what I do online, here are the blogs I read, here is how I disclose or don't disclose on my Facebook, here are the Twitter communities that I'm in, here's how I use Snapchat, here's how I use Grindr. All of these sort of things that that once I saw that coming up in every interview, I was like, okay, this is something that needs to be explored. And so that was something that I found that students had a lot of distinct, or a lot of overlapping purposes for going online and for really embracing social media. I would say a lot of the students in the study would be very active users of social media and online media, in part because for some folks who are really embracing this intersection of identities, someone said that this was sort of the only, online was kind of the only place that she felt like she could really embrace all of it and connect with people in far-flung geographic places. But there were so many purposes that students use social media for, in terms of, educating themselves, sort of learning about different identities, and maybe even learning different terms and different terminology and labels they might use to apply to themselves. Certainly to connect with others, whether that was romantic or sexual partners, whether that was finding out what's going on, in the campus or more broadly in the city around these issues. It was talking about, day-to-day realities of their impairment or disability and joining specific forums or specific blogs. or communities that might discuss that. So it was students, I was really, just blown away by the multiplicity of ways that students were using those online venues to really shape their identity. And I try to question in the piece sort of this binary between online and offline. So, right, sometimes we might think that, oh, online, is that just an extension of your sort of offline identity, or is it a sort of a substitute for it? But I think that students were sort of merging those in really interesting ways and sort of creating or recreating particular identities in the online space that may or may not neatly apply to the offline space.
Great, thank you so much. And so that actually brings us roughly to the end of our time today, as well as the questions that we have. I want to thank the folks who joined us so much for being here for the conversation, and also a big thanks to Ryan for sharing your research and expertise and time with us. So thank you all. I do hope you all stay I'm not phrasing this right, that you'll be on the lookout for an announcement soon for the next in our Research Roundtable series. There we go. And for that Research Roundtable presentation, Spencer will be back and certainly facilitates these much more smoothly than I do. So do bear with us while we're having these technical difficulties, and Spencer will be back to fix them next time. So again, thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you everybody for participating.
Thank you, Zeke, and thank you all for joining us. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Great days to you all. Take care.